Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, and I am 32 years old, hit subscribe, this happened, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and the rain had been falling steadily for hours. Settle in, turning the once firm trail into a treacherous slurry of mud and loose stones. My hiking boots, expensive and supposedly waterproof, had surrendered an hour ago. Each step now brought a squelching sensation as water oozed between my toes. "How much further to the cabin?" Malia asked, her voice barely audible over the drumming of raindrops on the forest canopy. I checked my phone again. No signal, of course. The GPS app had frozen 15 minutes ago, the blue dot of our location suspended in digital limbo somewhere at the remote eastern edge of Koki State Park on Kauai. I'd been here once before, years ago when the park seemed friendlier, more welcoming. Now, as darkness approached, the dense vegetation pressing in from all sides felt oppressive, almost hostile. "Should be just over this ridge," I said with far more confidence than I felt. "Another mile, maybe less." Malia nodded, adjusting her pack. At 29, she was the more experienced hiker between us, but even she looked uneasy. This was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway, our first vacation together after dating for 8 months. A chance to disconnect from our hectic jobs in Honolulu and reconnect with each other in nature. Nature, it seemed, had other plans. We'd set out from the Alakai Swamp trailhead that morning, aiming for one of the remote backcountry cabins nestled in the misty highlands. The forecast had promised occasional light showers, nothing more. By noon, the sky had darkened to the color of a fresh bruise, and by 2, the deluge had begun. "Aiden," Malia's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Does anything about this trail seem off to you?" I glanced around. The path ahead narrowed between 2 massive ohia trees, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural archway dripping with water. Mist curled around their trunks, dancing in the fading light. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted, tucking a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "Just a feeling, like we've been here before." An uneasy sensation crawled up my spine. I'd been having the same thought for the past hour but had dismissed it as fatigue. The dense forest, the particular arrangement of boulders beside the trail, that fallen log with the peculiar mushrooms sprouting from its decaying bark, all seemed eerily familiar, despite us supposedly traversing new ground. "Let's just keep moving," I said, reaching for her hand. "Daylight's fading fast." The cabin had been booked through the State Park Service, basic accommodations with no electricity or running water, but it would provide shelter from the rain and a place to dry out. At least, that was the plan. As we continued along the increasingly indistinct path, the mist grew thicker, swirling around us in ghostly tendrils. The dense fog muffled sounds, creating an unsettling blanket of silence punctuated only by our breathing and the occasional drip of water from leaf to forest floor. After another 20 minutes of hiking, Malia stopped abruptly. "Aiden," she said, her voice tight. "Look." She pointed to a large rock beside the trail. Embedded in its side was a small wooden sign, weathered and barely legible. "Kamawaialualani Trail." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible." "What is it?" "That's the trail we started on," I said, my mouth suddenly dry despite the surrounding moisture. 6 hours ago." Malia stared at me, her eyes widening. "But we've been walking in one direction the whole time. How could we be back at the beginning?" I pulled out my phone again, desperation growing as I waited for the GPS to connect. Nothing. The screen showed only the frozen map from earlier, the battery indicator now flashing red. I fumbled in my pack for the paper map I'd brought as a backup. The rain had turned it into a soggy, illegible mess. "Let's try calling for help," Malia suggested, already reaching for her own phone. After a moment, she shook her head. Dead. Darkness was descending rapidly now, the thick cloud cover and dense forest canopy hastening nightfall. We needed shelter, and fast. "There's a ranger station about half a mile from the trailhead," I said. trying to recall the park layout from memory. If we've somehow looped back to the beginning, we should be able to find it. We set off again, following what we hoped was the main trail. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, but the mist had thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. Our headlamps created eerie halos in the fog, the beams seeming to bounce back at us rather than illuminate the way forward. After walking for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a structure, not the ranger station we'd hoped for, but a simple wooden cabin. Relief flooded through me. "This must be it," I said. "We somehow made it to the cabin after all." Malia frowned, scanning the small building. "Doesn't look like the photos from the reservation website." She was right. This cabin was older, more weathered than the refurbished state park accommodations we'd booked. The wooden walls had darkened with age, and the small porch sagged slightly in the middle. But at this point, any shelter was welcome. I approached cautiously, my headlamp beam playing across the structure. There was a strange symbol carved into the door, a spiral pattern with what looked like small figures dancing around its edges. Probably some local cultural marking, I reasoned, though I couldn't recall seeing anything like it in my previous visits to the Hawaiian Islands. "Hello," I called out in case another lost hiker had already claimed the space. No response. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a low creak that set my teeth on edge. The interior was basic: a small table with 2 chairs, a crude stone fireplace, and a narrow bed frame with a bare mattress in the corner. Dusty shelves lined one wall, holding an assortment of canned goods, their labels faded beyond recognition. "Should we stay?" Malia whispered, lingering on the threshold. A crack of thunder answered for us, followed immediately by a renewed downpour that drummed against the cabin's tin roof. "Not much choice," I replied, pulling her gently inside and closing the door against the worsening storm. We shed our soaking outer layers and hung them from a row of pegs on the wall. I got to work starting a fire in the small hearth while Malia took inventory of our remaining supplies. The tension in my shoulders began to ease as the first flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow throughout the single room. "Well, we won't go hungry tonight," Malia announced, laying out our provisions on the table. "And look what I found." She held up a dusty bottle of amber liquid. "Looks like someone left behind some local spirits." I examined the unlabeled bottle skeptically. "I'm not sure we should drink that." "Just a sip to warm up," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I could tell she was still unnerved by our inexplicable circular journey through the forest. After a simple meal of trail mix and jerky, we spread our sleeping bags on the narrow bed. Despite our exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. The storm outside had intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners while rain pounded the roof in irregular, almost deliberate patterns. "Aiden," Malia whispered in the darkness, "do you hear that?" I had been drifting on the edge of consciousness but came fully alert at her words. Through the cacophony of the storm, there was something else. A rhythmic sound like chanting, barely audible. "Probably just the wind," I said, not believing it myself. "It sounds like voices." I strained to listen. The chanting grew slightly louder, the words indistinct but the cadence unmistakably human. Then came another sound that made my blood freeze, a high-pitched keening that no human throat could produce, rising above the chanting before fading into the night. Malia's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers ice-cold despite the fire's warmth. "Is there anyone else supposed to be out here?" she asked. "The ranger said this section of the park was closed to other hikers this weekend," I replied. "Something about trail maintenance." The chanting continued, neither growing louder nor fading away, maintaining its eerie presence just at the threshold of hearing. It was like a soundtrack designed specifically to prevent sleep, to keep us on edge. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was awakened by silence. The storm had passed and the chanting had stopped. Pale moonlight filtered through the cabin's single window, casting silver patterns across the wooden floor. Malia's side of the bed was empty. "Malia," I called softly, then louder when she didn't respond. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The cabin door stood ajar, a ribbon of mist snaking in from outside. My heart pounding, I pulled on my boots, still damp but no longer soaking, and grabbed my jacket. Had she just stepped outside to use the bathroom? But why not wake me? The night air was cool and heavy with moisture as I stepped onto the porch. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, the surrounding forest a wall of impenetrable shadow. "Malia!" I called, my voice absorbed by the mist. A flicker of movement caught my eye, something pale disappearing into the trees at the far edge of the clearing. Without thinking, I plunged after it, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I ran. The forest closed around me immediately, branches clawing at my face and arms. The trail, if there ever was one, was invisible in the darkness. I stumbled forward, guided only by brief glimpses of something light-colored moving ahead of me. "Malia, wait!" I shouted, though I was no longer certain it was her I was following. I burst through a tangle of vegetation into another clearing, smaller than the one with the cabin. In its center stood a circle of stones, each about waist-high, arranged in a perfect ring. Within the circle was a flat stone altar of sorts, its surface stained dark with what I desperately hoped was not blood. My headlamp flickered, dimmed, and went out, leaving me in the pale blue moonlight that seemed to concentrate strangely on the stone circle, as if the sight itself attracted the light. Movement again, this time from within the circle. A figure stepped from behind the altar and relief flooded through me. "Malia, what are you doing out here?" She turned toward me and my relief curdled into horror. It looked like Malia. Her face, her body, her curly dark hair now dried and flowing freely, but her eyes were wrong. They reflected the moonlight like a cat's, glowing faintly green in the darkness. "Hayden," she said, her voice oddly flat, "I found something important." I took an involuntary step backward. "Malia, you're scaring me. Let's go back to the cabin." She smiled, and I noticed her teeth seemed sharper than they should be. "Don't you want to see?" Before I could respond, a new sound emerged from the forest surrounding us. The same chanting we'd heard earlier, but louder now, more insistent. From between the trees, figures emerged, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. They wore traditional Hawaiian clothing, their faces obscured by wooden masks carved with grotesque expressions. "Friends," Malia said, gesturing toward the approaching figures. "They've been waiting for us." "Malia, something's wrong. These people—" "Not people," she interrupted, still smiling that too-sharp smile. "Kamawaielu Alani." The name of the trail we'd been following, I realized. But it was more than that. The word tumbled from her lips with a reverence that chilled me. One of the masked figures stepped forward, taller than the rest. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "You have brought him as promised, Malia. Well done." My girlfriend, or whatever she had become, inclined her head in acknowledgement. "What's going on?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "Malia, what have you done?" "What was necessary," she replied simply. "The forest needed you. I merely provided the means." The tall figure removed his mask, revealing a face that might once have been handsome, but was now a network of ritual scars, forming patterns similar to the spiral carved on the cabin door. "I am Kanaloa," he said, "keeper of this sacred ground." The name triggered a distant memory. Kanaloa, one of the 4 major gods in Hawaiian mythology, associated with the underworld and darkness. "This isn't real," I said, backing away. "You're not. You can't be. Gods? Spirits?" He laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally through the clearing. "Such limited terms for what we are. We have existed in these forests since before your kind gave names to fear." The chanting grew louder, the other masked figures moving into the stone circle, forming a ring around the altar. Malia joined them, her movements synchronized with theirs as if she'd been practicing this ritual her entire life. "The cabin," I said, suddenly understanding. "It was a trap." "A way station," Kanaloa corrected. "One of many throughout these islands. Places where the veil between worlds thins, allowing us to reach through, to call to those who are needed." Needed for what? Instead of answering, he gestured to Malia. She approached me, moving with that same fluid grace that seemed both beautiful and profoundly wrong. "I'm sorry it had to be you," she said, though her tone held no remorse. "But the forest has been hungry for so long. The offerings have been insufficient." Fear became a living thing inside me, clawing at my throat, urging me to run. But my legs wouldn't respond, my body suddenly heavy as stone. "What did you put in that bottle?" I managed to ask, remembering the unmarked alcohol she'd found or had planted in the cabin. "Just enough to make you sleep," she replied. "To open your mind to influences normally kept at bay by your rational thoughts." One of the masked figures handed her a curved knife, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. The metal looked ancient, its surface covered in the same spiral patterns as the door and Kanaloa's scarred face. "The islands are changing," Kanaloa said, circling me slowly. "Your people build and build, driving us back, weakening the old powers, but some places remain ours. Some rituals still hold power." "Malia," I pleaded, finding my voice again, "this isn't you. Whatever they've done to you—" "They've shown me truth," she interrupted. "I've seen what lies beneath the surface of our world, Aiden. The price of balance." With horrifying clarity, I finally understood. "You were never lost. You led me here deliberately." Her smile was sad now. The signs were there from the beginning. The circular trail, the cabin appearing exactly when we needed shelter. "Did you never wonder why I suggested this particular path? This specific weekend?" My mind raced back over our relationship, our meeting at a cultural preservation fundraiser, her growing interest in traditional Hawaiian spirituality, her insistence that we take this trip despite my reservations about the weather. Had it all been leading to this moment? "Why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because you have no family on the islands," she replied with terrible practicality. "No close friends who would search too hard when you disappeared. Because your company is one of those building resorts on sacred land. Because you were. Convenient." The chanting reached a crescendo, the masked figures moving faster around the circle. The moonlight seemed to solidify, becoming almost liquid as it pooled around the altar. I felt my body being moved, not by hands, but by some invisible force, drawing me toward the center of the circle. My feet dragged across the ground, leaving furrows in the soft earth as I struggled against the pull. "Please," I gasped. "Malia, this isn't you." For a moment, just a moment, her eyes seemed to clear, the unnatural glow fading. Doubt flickered across her face. Kanaloa noticed too. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging in with visible pressure. "Do not falter," he commanded. "Remember your oath." Whatever moment of humanity I'd glimpsed vanished. Malia's eyes hardened again, the eerie glow returning. "I'm sorry, Aiden," she said, raising the knife, "but the forest must feed." With desperate strength born of terror, I broke free of the invisible hold, lunging away from the altar. I crashed through the line of chanting figures, feeling hands grasp at my clothing but somehow slipping through. I ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, the chanting transformed into anger, voices calling out commands in a language I didn't recognize. The forest seemed to conspire against my escape, vines reaching down to ensnare me, the ground itself becoming treacherously uneven. Yet I pressed on, driven by pure survival instinct. After what felt like hours of frantic flight, I collapsed against the trunk of a massive tree, my lungs burning. The forest around me had grown still, no sounds of pursuit reaching my ears. Had I lost them? Or were they simply waiting, knowing these woods far better than I ever could? Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the canopy. With the growing illumination came a desperate hope. Perhaps the nightmarish events had been hallucinations, brought on by exhaustion and whatever had been in that bottle Malia had found. Malia? My chest tightened as I thought of her. Had she been part of this cult all along? Or had they somehow taken control of her mind? The latter seemed more plausible. The woman I'd known for 8 months couldn't have been faking everything. Could she? I needed to find help, to get back to civilization. Using the rising sun as a guide, I began moving east, reasoning that if I continued long enough in one direction, I would eventually reach a road or trail. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing, though no less disorienting. After an hour of steady hiking, I came across a small stream and followed it downhill, recalling the advice that water routes often lead to populated areas. The stream widened gradually, the terrain becoming less steep. Hope kindled within me as I detected signs of human presence. An old beer can wedged between rocks, a length of fishing line tangled in overhanging branches. I was getting closer to somewhere. Then I saw her. Malia was sitting on a boulder beside the stream, calmly drinking from a water bottle. Her hiking clothes were pristine, showing none of the wear and tear from our journey. She looked up as I approached, her face breaking into a relieved smile that contained no trace of the malevolence I'd witnessed during the night. "Aiden, thank God!" She rushed toward me, arms outstretched. "Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere." I recoiled from her touch, stumbling backward until I pressed against a tree trunk. "Stay away from me," I warned, grabbing a fallen branch and holding it between us like a weapon. Confusion and hurt flashed across her face. "Aiden, what's wrong? What happened to you?" She looked genuinely concerned, taking in my scratched face, torn clothing, and wild eyes. If this was an act, it was masterful. "Don't pretend," I spat. "The ritual, the stone circle, Kanaloa, I remember everything." Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? What ritual? What stone circle?" "Last night, after we found the cabin—" "Cabin?" she interrupted, her confusion appearing genuine. "Aiden, we never found a cabin. You ran off into the forest during the storm. I've been searching for you all night with the park rangers." As if on cue, voices called from downstream. 2 uniformed figures appeared around a bend in the stream, relief evident on their faces when they spotted us. "You found him," one called out, a stocky man with graying hair and a Park Service badge reading Makoa. "He's hurt," Malia called back, and confused. The rangers approached cautiously, taking in my defensive posture and the makeshift weapon in my hands. "Mr. Foster?" the older ranger asked. "I'm Ranger Makoa. We've had search teams out all night after Ms. Kealoha reported you missing. Are you injured?" I looked from the rangers to Malia, doubt creeping in. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare brought on by exposure and exhaustion? "There was a cabin," I said, my voice sounding uncertain even to my own ears. "A stone circle, people in masks." The rangers exchanged glances. "There's no cabin in this part of the park," the younger ranger said gently. "You were reported missing from the Alakai Swamp Trail when you ran ahead during the storm and didn't return." "That's not what happened," I insisted, though the conviction in my voice was fading. "Malia and I got lost together. We found a cabin. She was with them." Malia approached slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "Aiden, you've been alone in the forest all night. You must have fallen, hit your head. Let the rangers help you." I looked into her eyes, normal brown eyes with no unnatural glow, filled with concern and what looked like genuine love. Had I imagined everything? Reluctantly, I allowed the rangers to lead me back to the main trail. They explained that after I disappeared, Malia had made it back to the trailhead and called for help. Search teams had been combing the forest all night. It made sense. It was logical. Far more logical than a cult of mask-wearing followers of Hawaiian deities using my girlfriend as bait for a sacrifice. As we hiked back toward civilization, Malia walked beside me, occasionally touching my arm reassuringly. Each time I had to fight the urge to pull away. "The doctor said you might experience confusion," she said softly at one point. "After what happened in Honolulu last week." I stopped dead in my tracks. "What are you talking about? What happened in Honolulu?" The Rangers paused as well, looking back at us with concern. Malia gave them a small smile. "It's okay. Dr. Ikaika said moments like this might happen. He just needs a reminder." She turned back to me, her voice gentle as if speaking to a child. "You had an episode, Aiden, at work. They think it was brought on by stress. That's why we came on this trip. The doctor thought the fresh air would help." My head swam. I had no memory of any episode, any doctor. But then, if I'd had some kind of psychotic break, would I remember it? "I don't—" "It's okay," she soothed. "It's coming back piece by piece. That's what Dr. Ikaika said would happen." We continued walking, my mind racing to sort reality from delusion. By the time we reached the ranger station, I'd almost convinced myself that Malia's explanation made sense. Almost. The Rangers offered to call an ambulance, but Malia assured them she could drive me to the hospital in Lihu herself. They seemed to know her, to trust her judgment. As we walked to her car in the nearly empty parking lot, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A small wooden charm hanging from her rearview mirror. A spiral pattern, identical to the one carved on the cabin door and scarred into Kanaloa's face. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the charm. Malia glanced at it. "Just something I picked up at a local market, for protection during our hike." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Clearly, it worked for one of us. As we drove away from the park, I stared out the window at the receding forest. In the side mirror, I glimpsed a tall figure standing at the trailhead, a man whose face was a network of ritual scars, watching our departure with an expression of patient certainty. Malia followed my gaze in the mirror and smiled again, her eyes briefly flashing green in the afternoon sunlight. "Some journeys," she said softly, "take more than one attempt to complete." I closed my eyes, suddenly aware that our drive was taking us not toward Lihu and its hospital, but deeper into the island's interior, back toward the ancient forests and whatever waited for me there. And I realized, with a sinking feeling that settled into my bones, that the night's ritual had never truly ended. The forest was still hungry, and I was still its intended meal. As we rounded a bend in the road, the last cell tower disappeared from view. With it went my final connection to the outside world, to rationality and safety. Ahead lay only trees, darkness, and the patient hunger of ancient things that had learned to wait. I am Aiden Foster. I am 32 years old, and I am not expected to see 33. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I am 32 years old. This happened in August 2024. The rain had finally stopped when I pulled into the empty parking lot overlooking Waipio Valley. The big island's northern coast stretched out before me, lush and impossibly green after 3 days of downpour. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months, a chance to clear my head after the divorce and reassess what remained of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd chosen one of the most isolated spots in Hawaii to find myself. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Olivia. "Made it to Hawaii safe?" I typed back, "Just arrived at Waipio. Starting the hike tomorrow morning." "Alone? You sure that's smart?" I hesitated before responding. "I need this. Call you in 3 days when I'm back in cell range." I turned off my phone and slipped it into my backpack. The valley below was already cast in shadow as the afternoon sun dipped behind the western ridge. Locals called Waipio the Valley of the Kings, once home to ancient Hawaiian rulers. Now it was mostly abandoned, A few scattered residents, some taro farmers, and an ocean of green bisected by a single road so steep rental cars weren't allowed down it. Perfect. The trailhead parking lot was deserted except for my rented Jeep. Tourist season was winding down and the recent storms had likely deterred the usual visitors. I planned to hike down into Waipio Valley, cross it to reach the Mulawai Trail, then follow that along the coast through the even more remote Waimanu Valley. 3 days of isolation and wilderness. Exactly what I needed. I set up camp for the night in a small clearing near the parking lot, wanting to start fresh in the morning. As I hung my food bag from a tree branch, more out of habit than necessity since Hawaii had no large predators, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A man stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. He was Hawaiian, maybe in his 60s, with deep creases around his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. He wore faded work clothes and rubber boots caked with mud. "You heading down tomorrow?" he called out, nodding toward the valley. "That's the plan." I secured the rope around the tree trunk. He approached slowly, his hands in his pockets. "Going to Waimanu?" "Yeah, for a few days. You know the trail?" "All my life." He glanced at my tent, my gear, my solitary setup. "Going alone?" I nodded. Something in his tone made me feel defensive. "I've done plenty of solo hiking before." "Not here, you haven't." He looked toward the valley, now growing darker by the minute. "Valley's been strange since the storm. Water's high, trail's dangerous. I checked the reports. They said it's passable." "Reports." He made a dismissive sound. "Reports don't know what lives there." I forced a smile. "Bears? Wolves? Pretty sure Hawaii doesn't have those." He didn't return the smile. "The old ones called it na uluhipo." "What does that mean?" "The growing darkness." He turned to leave. "Stay on the trail. Don't go near the pools after dark. And if you hear someone call your name..." He paused. "Make sure you know who's doing the calling." Before I could ask what the hell that meant, he was walking away. At the edge of the parking lot, he stopped and called back. "What's your name?" "Heoli." "Ethan," I responded automatically. He nodded slowly. "I'm Keone. Remember that when you're down there. Remember that someone knows you're here." Then he was gone, vanishing into the gathering darkness as though he'd never been there at all. Sleep came uneasily that night. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with humidity and the scent of rotting vegetation. No insects chirped, no wind rustled the trees. Just dead silence broken occasionally by what sounded like distant whispers. Too faint to make out, but somehow familiar. I told myself it was just water trickling somewhere nearby, or perhaps the wind after all. But in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, rationality fights a losing battle against primal fear. I found myself straining to hear those whispers, convinced they were forming a single word, over and over. My name. Morning arrived with blessed normality. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds called from the forest, and I felt ridiculous about my midnight anxieties. I broke camp efficiently, had a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, and shouldered my pack. The trailhead beckoned, a steep path disappearing into the green canopy below. I took one last look at my Jeep and started down. The descent into Waipio Valley was more challenging than I'd expected. The trail dropped nearly 1,000 feet in less than a mile, the path slick with mud from the recent rains. My hiking boots kept losing purchase, forcing me to grab onto roots and branches to avoid tumbling down the incline. By the time I reached the valley floor, my legs were trembling from the effort, and my clothes were plastered to my skin with sweat despite the cool morning air. The valley spread before me, a vast green expanse bordered by sheer cliffs on 3 sides and the Pacific Ocean on the 4th. A single dirt road cut through fields of taro, leading past scattered houses and eventually to the black sand beach at the valley's mouth. I checked my map and started walking. To reach the Mulawai Trail, I needed to cross the valley and ford Waipio Stream near where it emptied into the ocean. Then the real hike would begin. 13 miles of rugged coastline trail to Waimanu Valley, my destination. The valley was eerily quiet as I walked. I passed a few houses but saw no people. Abandoned farm equipment sat rusting in overgrown fields. Even the ubiquitous Hawaiian chickens were nowhere to be seen. The only sound was the squish of mud under my boots and my own breathing. After about an hour, I reached Waipio Stream. The recent storms had swollen it considerably, transforming what should have been a manageable ford into a serious obstacle. The water rushed past, brown with sediment, carrying branches and debris toward the ocean. I studied the crossing, looking for the shallowest point. About 50 yards upstream, the water seemed calmer, spreading wider over a rocky section. I headed there, removed my boots, tied them to my pack, and began wading across. The cold water took my breath away. The current was stronger than it appeared, pushing insistently against my legs. Halfway across, in water up to my thighs, I heard something that made me freeze. My name. Ethan. Not whispered this time, but clearly spoken, as if someone stood right beside me. I whipped around, nearly losing my balance in the rushing water. No one was there. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding thin and insignificant against the backdrop of flowing water and towering cliffs. No response. A trick of the water, I told myself. Sound plays strangely in valleys like this. Probably just some hikers on the trail ahead, their voices carrying. I hurried to finish crossing, my skin prickling with unease. As I scrambled up the far bank, I glanced back at my footprints leading into the water. For a disorienting moment, it looked like there were two sets of prints beside mine. One slightly smaller, as if someone had been walking next to me, unseen. I blinked, and there was only mud. The entrance to the Mulawai Trail was marked by a weathered sign warning hikers about the difficulty ahead. 13 miles, 11 gulches to cross, unpredictable weather, dangerous terrain. A final line, added in permanent marker, read simply, "Stay on the trail." I started climbing. The first mile of the Mulawai Trail was the steepest, switchbacking up the cliff face out of Waipio Valley. The path was narrow, barely wider than my shoulders in places, with a sheer drop on one side. The recent rains had made sections treacherously slippery. Twice I lost my footing, once catching myself on a root that tore at my palm, leaving a ragged scrape. By the time I reached the top, I was drenched in sweat again. I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. Waipio Valley lay spread beneath me like a green carpet. The stream I'd crossed now a silver ribbon winding toward the ocean. The black sand beach was visible in the distance, empty save for the relentless waves. As I turned to continue, something caught my eye at the edge of the cliff. A small stone structure, like a miniature altar with wilted flowers and what looked like food offerings placed carefully on top. A Hawaiian spiritual site of some kind, I assumed. I'd read about these, but hadn't expected to encounter one so soon. I respectfully gave it a wide berth and continued on the trail. The path now followed the coastline on top of the cliffs, dipping down into gulches formed by streams that flowed to the ocean, then climbing back up the other side. The first few gulches were manageable, though the recent rains had turned the trail into a muddy channel in places. Around midday, I stopped in a patch of shade to eat lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and trail mix. As I ate, I became aware of how completely alone I was. I hadn't seen another person since Keone the night before. No hikers, no residents, not even distant boats on the ocean below. The isolation I'd sought now felt oppressive rather than liberating. I checked my watch. 5 hours of hiking had taken me about 6 miles along the trail. At this rate, I'd reach Waimanu Valley by late afternoon, with enough time to set up camp before dark. I shouldered my pack and continued. The 6th gulch was the worst yet. The trail descended steeply into a narrow ravine where a swollen stream churned through a jumble of boulders. The crossing looked dangerous. No clear path, just moss-slick rocks amid fast-moving water. I studied it carefully, plotting my route. Step on that flat rock, then to the boulder, then the fallen tree trunk that spanned the narrowest section. It looked doable, if not exactly safe. I had just put my foot on the first rock when I heard it again. Ethan. Clear as day, from just behind my right shoulder. I spun around so fast I nearly tumbled into the water. No one was there, just the empty trail behind me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the ravine walls. "This isn't funny." Only the rushing water answered me. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. I scanned the trail again, looking for any movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing. Get across the stream, I told myself. Get to Waimanu. There might be other hikers camped there. I forced myself to focus on the crossing, placing each foot carefully. The rocks were even more slippery than they looked. Halfway across, balancing on a boulder, I reached for the fallen tree trunk that would take me the rest of the way. As my fingers touched the rough bark, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wood, fresh enough that pale splinters still clung to the grooves, was my name. Ethan. I yanked my hand back as if the wood had burned me. This wasn't possible. No one knew I was here except Keone, and he couldn't have gotten ahead of me on the trail. Unless he knew another way. Unless he'd been here before me. With shaking legs, I finished crossing the stream, no longer caring about keeping my boots dry. I just splashed through the water, scrambled up the far bank, and hurried up the trail, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that carved name. The afternoon wore on. The trail grew more challenging. Or perhaps it was just my fraying nerves making everything seem worse. The sun disappeared behind gathering clouds and the temperature dropped noticeably. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Not good. Another storm would make the trail even more dangerous, possibly impassable if the streams rose further. I increased my pace, pushing through fatigue and the growing sense of dread that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, fundamentally, irreparably wrong, with this place. As I crested the last ridge before Waimanu Valley, the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, instantly soaking through my rain jacket and pack. Thunder cracked overhead, followed by lightning that illuminated the darkening landscape in stark white flashes. Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out Waimanu Valley below, a green bowl surrounded by towering cliffs, with a black sand beach facing the churning ocean. Somewhere down there were the designated campsites I'd planned to use. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing on the trail ahead of me. A dark silhouette against the sudden brightness. When my vision cleared, there was no one there. I had to get down into the valley before dark. I had to find shelter. The descent into Waimanu was a nightmare. The trail had transformed into a flowing stream of mud, with footholds disappearing under my boots. Twice I fell, sliding several feet before managing to grab onto something. By the time I reached the valley floor, darkness was falling fast, and I was covered in mud from head to toe. I stumbled toward where I knew the campsites should be, my headlamp cutting a weak path through the rain and gloom. The first site I found was flooded, ankle-deep water standing where a tent should go. The second was little better. At the third site, I found a relatively dry patch under the spreading branches of a massive tree. It would have to do. With numb fingers, I set up my tent, fighting the wind that threatened to tear the rainfly from my hands. Finally, I crawled inside, stripped off my wet clothes, and changed into my only dry set. The rain hammered on the tent like impatient fingers. I ate a cold dinner of jerky and trail mix, too exhausted to bother with my camp stove. As I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage outside, I tried to make sense of the day's events. The voice calling my name, the carved wood, the feeling of being watched, followed. Maybe I was losing it. The divorce had hit me harder than I'd admitted, even to myself. Maybe this isolation wasn't what I needed after all. I fumbled for my phone, irrationally hoping for a signal despite knowing there wouldn't be one this deep in the valley. Sure enough, no service. I was completely cut off. Outside, the wind suddenly died. The rain continued, but the howling gale that had bent treetops and threatened to flatten my tent simply stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and unnatural. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, squelching in the mud outside my tent. They circled once, paused at the entrance. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. The footsteps continued around to the back of the tent. I fumbled for my headlamp, switched it on, and pointed it at the tent wall. The light illuminated the nylon fabric, turning it into a pale screen. And projected on that screen was a shadow, a human shape, standing motionless just outside. "Hello?" I tried again, fighting to keep my voice steady. I have a weapon. A lie. The closest thing to a weapon I had was a pocket knife with a 3-inch blade. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, its outline swaying slightly in the rain. I watched, paralyzed, as it slowly raised one arm, extending a finger toward the tent wall. The fingertip touched the fabric, creating a small depression. Then it began to move, tracing a pattern across the nylon. Letters. My name. Again. I screamed then, a raw, primal sound that tore from my throat without conscious thought. I scrambled backward, pressing against the far wall of the tent. The shadow vanished. I sat there for what felt like hours, my headlamp trained on the tent wall, waiting for the shadow to return. It didn't. Eventually, the rain stopped. The normal sounds of the night forest slowly returned. Insects buzzing, the distant crash of waves on the beach, the drip of water from leaves. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat upright in my sleeping bag until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent walls. Only then did I work up the courage to unzip the door and look outside. The campsite was empty. The ground, soaked from the night's rain, showed no footprints except my own from when I'd set up the tent. But on the trunk of a nearby tree, freshly carved into the bark, was my name. And below it, a single word: run. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely roll up my tent. The sky was overcast but not actively raining. Small mercies. I had to get out of this valley, back to the trail, back to civilization, back to anywhere but here. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something odd about the tree with my name carved in it. The cuts looked fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored against the dark bark. But surrounding the carving, the tree trunk was wrong. The bark appeared diseased, blackened in a perfect circle around my name, with thin dark lines radiating outward like veins or roots. I looked around at the other trees near my campsite. All of them had similar blackened patches, spreading up from the ground as if the soil itself was infected with something that the trees were drawing up into themselves. I got moving. The beach was the quickest way out of Waimanu Valley. From there, I could pick up the Mulawai Trail again and make the grueling 13-mile trek back to Waipio. It wouldn't be easy after a sleepless night, but staying another day in this place wasn't an option. The black sand beach was deserted when I reached it. Waves crashed against the shore with unusual intensity, sending spray high into the air. The ocean seemed angry, churning with whitecaps as far as I could see. I turned east, following the curve of the beach toward where the trail began its ascent out of the valley. As I walked, something caught my eye in the wet sand near the water's edge, impressions that looked disturbingly like footprints. They paralleled my course, appearing from nowhere about 20 yards to my right, closer to the water. They were distinct, human, and based on their size, made by someone smaller than me. The prints emerged from the surf as if someone had walked straight out of the ocean. I quickened my pace. The footprints kept pace with me, maintaining their distance. When I stopped, the next print would appear only after I took my next step, as if whatever made them was waiting. matching my rhythm exactly. I broke into a run. The footprints ran too. I reached the end of the beach where a stream emptied into the ocean, forming a natural boundary between the beach and the forested area where the trail began. The footprints stopped at the water's edge. I splashed across the shallow stream, not bothering to remove my boots, and scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side. The trail marker was visible about 50 yards ahead, where the path began its climb out of the valley. I was gasping for breath when I reached it, my pack suddenly seeming twice as heavy. I leaned against a tree, trying to collect myself. That's when I saw the woman. She stood on the trail ahead of me, perhaps 30 feet away. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, with long dark hair that hung wet and limp around her thin shoulders. She wore what looked like a once white dress, now gray and tattered, plastered to her body as if she'd been swimming in it. Her feet were bare and caked with black sand. "Hello," I called, my voice hoarse. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't move. Her face was downturned, hidden behind the curtain of her hair. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you have a camp nearby?" Still no response. But slowly, so slowly it seemed almost mechanical, she raised her head. Her face, I still have nightmares about her face. It wasn't a face at all. Where features should have been was smooth, blank skin stretched tight over a skull with only the slightest indentations where eyes, nose, and mouth should be, like a department store mannequin, but organic, alive. Yet somehow I could feel her looking at me, feel her attention like a physical weight. I backed away. She took a step forward. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard her moving, not running but walking with unhurried confidence. The sound of her bare feet on the muddy trail was wet and obscene, like rotten fruit being crushed. I ran blindly, no longer caring about the trail, just needing to get away from that faceless horror. I crashed through underbrush, stumbled over fallen logs, my pack catching on branches that tore at my clothes and skin. I don't know how long I ran. Long enough that my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself in a part of the valley I didn't recognize. The tall cliffs that ringed Wimanu were visible in all directions, but I had no idea where the trail was, or even which direction I'd come from. I was lost. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sank to my knees in the mud, fighting back panic. I had to think. Had to get control of myself. I fumbled in my pack for my map and compass, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unfold the laminated paper. The map told me nothing I didn't already know. I was somewhere in Waimanu Valley, off the trail. The compass at least gave me direction. The ocean was west. If I headed that way, I'd eventually hit the beach again. From there, I could reorient myself. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and started walking west. The valley floor was a maze of vegetation. Ferns taller than me, tangled vines that caught at my ankles, stands of bamboo so dense I had to force my way through. The ground was uneven, pockmarked with hidden holes that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. After about an hour of this, I emerged into a small clearing. At its center was a pool of dark water, perfectly circular, like an enormous well. The water was absolutely still, not even a ripple disturbing its obsidian surface despite the light rain that had started to fall again. "Don't go near the pools after dark," Keone had warned me. It wasn't dark yet, but the sky was heavily overcast, the light flat and gray, close enough to make me wary. I started to skirt around the edge of the clearing, giving the pool a wide berth. As I passed it, something made me pause and look back. The rain falling on the pool's surface should have created ripples, but the water remained mirror smooth, unnatural. As I watched, the raindrops seemed to slow as they approached the surface, hovering momentarily before being absorbed without a trace. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep walking, I took a step closer. My reflection appeared in the dark water, but it wasn't right. The face looking back at me was haggard, Eyes sunken and wild, skin stretched too tight across my cheekbones. I looked like I'd been lost for weeks, not hours. As I stared, my reflection changed. The face in the water smiled, though I was certain my own expression remained frozen in horror. The reflection's eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until there was nothing but blackness. Then it reached up, pressed its palm against the underside of the water's surface as if trapped beneath a sheet of ice. I stumbled backward with a cry. The surface of the pool erupted, water shooting upward in a column that rose 6 feet into the air before collapsing back down with a splash that sprayed my legs despite my distance. When the water settled, she was there. The faceless woman from the trail, now standing in the center of the pool, the black water only up to her knees, though the pool had to be much deeper. Water streamed from her hair, her dress, running down her smooth, blank face. She took a step toward me, then another, walking out of the pool as easily as if ascending a set of stairs. Her movements were wrong, jerky yet fluid at the same time, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I ran again. This time I heard her behind me, not walking now, but running too, her bare feet slapping wetly against the muddy ground. She moved fast, much faster than should have been possible. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw her gaining on me, that blank face now inches from the back of my neck. I tripped on an exposed root and went down hard, my pack twisting awkwardly and pinning one arm beneath me. I rolled, frantically trying to free myself, certain that when I looked up, she would be looming over me. There was nothing there. I scrambled to my feet, looking in all directions. The faceless woman had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. The forest around me was silent except for the soft patter of rain on leaves and my own ragged breathing. I adjusted my pack with trembling hands and tried to get my bearings. The fall had disorientated me, and the overcast sky made it difficult to determine direction without my compass. I dug it out of my pocket and confirmed that I was still heading roughly west. The terrain began to slope upward. I should have been getting closer to the beach, but instead, I seemed to be climbing. Had I somehow gotten turned around? I checked the compass again, still pointing west. I kept walking. The incline grew steeper. The vegetation thinned, giving way to volcanic rock. I realized I was climbing one of the ridges that formed the valley wall. Not at all where I wanted to be, but at least from higher ground, I might be able to see the beach and reorient myself. The ridge narrowed as I climbed until I was following a spine of rock no wider than a sidewalk, with steep drops on either side. The wind had picked up, gusting strongly enough to make me sway. Far below, I could see the valley floor, a patchwork of green and brown bisected by silver streams. There, at last, was the beach, a dark crescent against the gray-blue ocean. I could even make out the mouth of the valley where the trail began its ascent. I wasn't as lost as I'd feared. I just needed to get down from this ridge and head northwest, and I'd intersect the trail. Relief flooded through me, making my knees weak. I wasn't going to die in this valley after all. Then I saw them. People, standing on the beach. Dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward. Even from this distance, I could tell something was wrong with them. They stood too still, their postures identical. As I watched, they raised their arms in unison, pointing toward the center of their circle. There was something there, something dark lying on the sand, but I couldn't make out what it was. A movement to my right caught my attention. Further along the ridge, perhaps 100 yards away, stood a figure, Keone. He was looking directly at me, his expression grim. When our eyes met, he beckoned urgently, then turned and disappeared over the far side of the ridge. I hesitated only a moment before following. Keone was the only person I'd met who seemed to know what was happening in this valley. If anyone could help me get out safely, it was him. The far side of the ridge was even steeper, but a narrow path had been worn into the rock, switchbacking down toward a dense patch of forest. I descended as quickly as I dared, sending small avalanches of loose stones cascading ahead of me. At the bottom, The forest closed around me like a fist. The trees here were different, older, gnarled, with trunks that twisted in unnatural ways. Their branches intertwined overhead, blocking what little daylight remained and plunging the forest floor into premature darkness. "Keone," I called, my voice swallowed by the dense vegetation. No answer. I pushed deeper into the forest, following what appeared to be a faint trail. The ground beneath my feet changed from dirt to stone. Flat, pitted stones that couldn't have been natural. I was on a path, one that had been deliberately constructed, though it was now overgrown and neglected. The path led to a clearing, and in the center of that clearing stood a structure. It resembled the small stone altar I'd seen near the beginning of the Mulawai Trail, but much larger, about chest-high with a flat-top surface. The stones were black and glossy, almost like obsidian but rougher. The entire structure was stained dark in places, the discoloration having the unsettling appearance of dried blood. Around the altar, arranged in a circle, were smaller stone pillars, each about knee-high. There were 13 of them, evenly spaced. The ground between the pillars and the altar had been cleared of vegetation, leaving bare earth that showed signs of recent disturbance, as if something had been dragged across it repeatedly. I approached cautiously, my skin crawling with the certain knowledge that I was trespassing in a place I shouldn't be. The altar radiated a palpable wrongness that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. "You shouldn't have come here." I whirled around. Keone stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A bad place. A hungry place." He stepped into the clearing but stayed well back from the altar. "The old ones built it to contain something that should never have been let loose. They failed." "The faceless woman." His eyes widened slightly. "You've seen her already. Then it's worse than I thought. She's chosen you." "Chosen me? What the hell does that mean?" "She needs a face." He said it simply, as if it were obvious. "She lost hers long ago when the first foreigners came to the islands, bringing their diseases and their guns and their gods. She was beautiful once, a chieftain's daughter. They took everything from her, her family, her home, her life. When she died, her grief and rage were so great that she refused to pass on. She stayed, feeding on the pain of others, growing stronger, taking what she needed to be whole again." "This is insane," I said, backing away from both Keone and the altar. "I need to get out of this valley, back to YPO. Can you help me or not?" "I can try, but she's marked you now. She'll follow. She always does." "What does she want from me?" Keone looked at me with something like pity. "I told you, she wants your face, your identity, your life. She's been hunting for centuries, trying to find the perfect match, someone whose pain mirrors her own, someone who's lost everything, who feels disconnected from themselves." He paused. "Someone like you." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the damp or the gathering darkness. How could he know about my divorce, about the emptiness I'd been carrying? "The trail," I said, forcing myself to focus on practical matters. "I need to find the trail back to Waipio." Keone nodded. "I can show you, but we need to hurry. Night is coming, and she's stronger in the dark." Without waiting for a response, he turned and headed back the way we'd come. I followed, casting one last glance at the altar. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the stone pillars, a flicker of white, like a tattered dress disappearing behind one of the columns. I ran to catch up with Keone. He led me through the forest at a pace that seemed remarkable for a man his age, never hesitating at junctions in the barely visible path, never slowing to check his direction. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. "How do you know so much about this place?" I asked as we climbed over a fallen tree trunk that blocked our way. "About her?" "My family has lived in Waipio for generations," he replied without looking back. "We're the keepers of the old stories, the ones tourists don't hear, the ones about what really happened when the outsiders came." "And this woman, she's real?" Not some kind of hallucination?" He stopped then and turned to face me. "She's as real as you or me. Maybe more real. She's been here longer than either of us, and she'll be here long after we're gone." He studied my face. "Unless she takes what she wants from you, then a part of her will be you, forever." He started walking again before I could respond. The forest was growing darker by the minute as evening approached. I switched on my headlamp, but the beam seemed weak and ineffective, swallowed by the abnormal gloom that surrounded us. Keone didn't use a light. He moved through the darkness with ease, occasionally pausing to wait for me to catch up when I fell behind. We emerged from the forest onto a rocky slope that led down to a narrow stream. On the far side, I could just make out what looked like the Muliwai Trail, winding along the contour of the valley wall. "That's it," I said with relief. "That's the trail." Keone nodded. "Cross here, follow it east. It will take you back to Waipio. Don't stop, even if you hear voices. Don't look back until you reach the valley." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. I extended my hand. Keone hesitated, then shook it. His palm was rough but surprisingly cold. "When you get back to the parking lot," he said, "leave immediately. Don't wait until morning. Drive as far away from here as you can." "I will." I adjusted my pack and started toward the stream. "And Ethan," he called after me, "remember what I said. If you hear someone call your name—" He trailed off. "Make sure I know who's doing the calling," I finished. He nodded solemnly. "May your gods protect you. Mine no longer can." With those unsettling words, he turned and disappeared back into the forest. The stream was fast-moving but shallow, barely up to my knees at its deepest point. I waded across carefully, the cold water numbing my feet even through my boots. On the far bank, I scrambled up to the trail and paused to orient myself. East. I needed to go east, back toward Waipio Valley. I checked my compass again and set off at the fastest pace I could manage. The sky was darkening rapidly now, and I knew I wouldn't reach Waipio before nightfall. The best I could hope for was to cover as much distance as possible before complete darkness forced me to camp again. The thought of spending another night in the open made my stomach clench with dread. But I had no choice. I hiked for about an hour, the trail rising and falling as it crossed the gulches that cut through the coastline. Each descent into a gulch filled me with apprehension, the shadows growing deeper as night approached. Each crossing of a stream made me remember the voice calling my name at Waipio Stream the day before. Had it only been a day? It felt like weeks. As twilight deepened into true darkness, I reluctantly began looking for a place to camp. The trail had widened slightly, running along a relatively flat section of the cliff top. About 20 yards to my right, away from the cliff edge, stood a small copse of trees that would provide some shelter. I set up my tent with mechanical efficiency, my body going through the motions while my mind remained hypervigilant, alert for any sound or movement that might signal her presence. I didn't bother with dinner, just crawled into the tent fully clothed, my boots still on, my pocket knife clutched in one hand. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion overtook me almost immediately. My last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever gods might be listening that I would wake up in the morning. A sound pulled me from sleep, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the outside of my tent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 like fingers. I lay perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. My watch read 3:17 a.m., the darkest part of the night. Tap, tap, tap. The sound moved around the tent, following the same pattern as the night before. Circling, testing, seeking a way in. I tightened my grip on the pocket knife, knowing it would be useless against whatever waited outside, but taking comfort in its solid presence nonetheless. The tapping stopped at the entrance to the tent. There was a long silence, broken only by the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, a whisper. "Ethan." It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, not threatening, almost sad. "Ethan, please, help me." I remained silent, remembering Keone's warning about voices in the night. "I'm lost," the voice continued, a note of desperation creeping in. "I've been wandering for hours. I saw your light. Please, I just need help finding the trail." It sounded so convincing, so human. If I hadn't seen the faceless horror in the forest, I might have believed it. Might have unzipped the tent to help a fellow hiker in distress. "Go away," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Whatever you are, leave me alone." Silence. Then a change in the voice, all pretense of humanity dropping away, replaced by something ancient and cold. "Open the tent, Ethan. Let me in. I can take away your pain. I can make you whole again." "No." A hiss of frustration, like steam escaping a pressure valve. The tent wall bulged inward as something pressed against it from outside. "Your wife left because she saw the emptiness in you," the voice said, cruel now, knowing exactly where to strike. "The hollow place where your soul should be. She saw that you're just a shell, going through the motions of living. I can fill that emptiness, Ethan. I can make you real again." My breath caught in my throat. How could it know about Kara? About the reasons she'd given when she left? The tent wall bulged further, the nylon stretching to its limit. A seam began to separate near the top, threads popping with tiny sounds like breaking bones. In desperation, I switched on my headlamp and shone it directly at the bulge. The fabric illuminated from inside, becoming a screen that revealed a silhouette on the other side. A figure with long hair and a dress, its arm extended, pressing against the tent. Its head was wrong, too smooth, too featureless. At the touch of the light, the figure recoiled with a sound that might have been pain. The pressure on the tent wall disappeared. Outside, I heard movement. Not the walking away I'd hoped for, but a strange sliding sound, like something dragging itself around the perimeter of the tent. The light. It was avoiding the light. I kept the headlamp on, pointing it at the tent wall, tracking the sounds as they circled. When they stopped, I moved the beam to that spot, illuminating another silhouette that quickly retreated. For what felt like hours, we played this macabre game of cat and mouse, the thing outside testing, probing, seeking a way in, me using the light to drive it back. My headlamp began to dim as the batteries drained, the beam growing weaker with each passing minute. Just when I thought the light would fail completely, leaving me defenseless, the first gray hints of dawn appeared, softening the darkness outside. The thing sensed it too. With a final hiss of frustration that raised the hair on my arms, I heard it retreat, sounds fading into the distance. I waited until full daylight before emerging from the tent. The ground around my campsite was churned into mud, marked with dozens of bare footprints that circled and crisscrossed in a chaotic pattern. Some of the prints were normal, human. Others were distorted, elongated, with too many toes or none at all. On my tent, where the seam had started to separate, someone, something, had written in mud. Tomorrow night, I broke camp in minutes, leaving half my gear behind in my haste. The only things I took were water, some energy bars, my map and compass, and my headlamp with the spare batteries from my pack. Everything else I abandoned, wanting only to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. The trail seemed clearer in the morning light, more defined than it had appeared the previous day. I made good progress, pushing myself to maintain a jogging pace where the terrain allowed it. By my estimation, I was about 6 or 7 miles from Waipio Valley, a distance I could cover in a few hours if I didn't stop. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned from exertion. Not when my legs trembled with fatigue. Not when the trail descended steeply into gulches that threatened to turn an ankle with every step. I kept moving, driven by a terror that overrode all physical discomfort. Around midday, I reached a viewpoint that overlooked Waipio Valley. The sight of it, green and peaceful in the distance, brought tears to my eyes. I was going to make it. I was going to escape. The descent into Waipio was as treacherous as the ascent had been, the steep trail slick with mud from recent rain. I half ran, half slid down, using tree roots and rocks as handholds to control my descent. At one point, my foot slipped and I tumbled several yards before catching myself, tearing my pants and scraping my leg badly. I barely noticed the pain. I was so close now. At the valley floor, I limped across the taro fields, ignoring the curious looks from the few farmers working there. I just needed to get to the road, to climb back out of the valley to where my Jeep waited in the parking lot. The road up from Waipio Valley is infamously steep, a 25% grade that requires four-wheel drive to navigate. On foot, it's an exhausting climb under the best circumstances. In my current state, exhausted, injured, and half-mad with fear, it was nearly impossible. But the thought of spending even one more minute in these valleys drove me forward, one foot in front of the other, one step at a time. I didn't allow myself to stop and rest, convinced that if I did, I would never get up again. By late afternoon, I staggered into the parking lot where I'd left my Jeep 3 days earlier. It sat there, dusty but undamaged, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. As I fumbled with my keys, a shadow fell across me. "You made it back," said a familiar voice. I spun around, nearly falling in my haste. Keone stood there, looking exactly as he had when I first met him. His eyes moved over me, taking in my torn clothes, the dried blood on my leg, my wild appearance. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. "And you survived." "Few do." He seemed impressed. "You should leave now, as I told you. Drive until you reach Hilo or Kona. Stay in a crowded place tonight, a hotel with lots of people. She's stronger here, near her home, but her reach extends across the island." "What about tomorrow night?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "She wrote on my tent that she would find you tomorrow night." Keone nodded gravely. "She will try. She's chosen you, and she won't give up easily, but each night you survive makes you stronger against her. Distance will help too. By the time you reach the mainland, her power over you will fade." "How do you know all this?" I asked, the question that had been nagging at me since our first meeting. A sad smile crossed his face. "Because I was chosen once too. Many years ago, when I was young and foolish and came to these valleys alone." He pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing a twisted scar that ran from his throat to his collarbone. "I survived, but not without cost. Now I watch for others like me, like you. I try to warn them when I can." "Thank you," I said simply, knowing there were no adequate words for what he'd done. He nodded once, then turned to leave. "Keone," I called after him. "The woman. What was her name? Before she became what she is now." He paused, considering. "The old stories call her Kaiulani, but names have power, especially hers. I wouldn't speak it again if I were you." With that final warning, he walked away, disappearing down the road that led back into Waipio Valley. I got in my Jeep, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached Hilo, checking into the first hotel I found, a crowded tourist place near the airport. I bought new clothes at a nearby store, showered for what felt like hours, and collapsed into bed, expecting to fall instantly asleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound in the hotel, doors closing, the ice machine down the hall, voices passing in the corridor, made me tense with anticipation. Each time I started to drift off, I jerked awake, certain I'd heard someone whispering my name. When darkness fell completely, I turned on every light in the room and sat against the headboard, watching the door, the windows, the closet, waiting. Nothing happened. No tapping on the walls, no silhouette against the curtains, no whispered voice calling my name. Maybe Keone was right. Maybe distance had weakened her. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I fell into a restless sleep. I dreamed of a pool of black water in a forest clearing, of a woman walking out of it, water streaming from her hair, her clothes. As she approached, her featureless face began to change, features emerging like a photograph developing. A nose, lips, eyes, my face, looking back at me with an expression of hunger that wasn't mine. I woke with a gasp, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. The clock read 3:17 a.m., the darkest part of the night. The room was still brightly lit from all the lamps I'd left on. Nothing seemed out of place. No one was there, except... The bathroom door was closed. I distinctly remembered leaving it open, wanting a clear view of the entire room. As I stared at it, the handle began to turn. Slowly, silently. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the room's entrance. The bathroom door opened a crack, darkness visible in the gap. In one desperate lunge, I grabbed my room key from the nightstand, yanked open the main door, and fled into the hallway. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door open fully, heard bare feet slapping wetly against the tile floor. I ran to the elevator, repeatedly jabbing the call button. The display showed the car descending from the 8th floor. 7th, 6th, too slow. Footsteps in the hallway behind me now. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. 5th floor, 4th. I abandoned the elevator and sprinted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, nearly falling in my haste. Behind me, the stairwell door opened. Those same wet footsteps began descending, unhurried but steadily gaining. I burst into the lobby, startling the night clerk, who looked up from his phone with wide eyes. "Sir, are you all right?" I must have looked insane, barefoot, wearing only a t-shirt and boxers, wild-eyed with panic. "I need to check out," I gasped. "Now, emergency." To his credit, the clerk didn't argue. He processed my credit card while casting nervous glances at me, probably wondering if he should call security. Behind me, the stairwell door opened. I didn't turn around, didn't need to. I could feel her presence like cold fingers on the back of my neck. "Your receipt, sir," the clerk said, holding out a piece of paper. His eyes flicked to something over my shoulder, and a look of confusion crossed his face. Is your friend okay?" I grabbed the receipt, my keys which I'd left at check-in, and ran for the parking lot without looking back. My Jeep was where I'd left it. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot with a screech of tires. In the rearview mirror, illuminated by the hotel's exterior lights, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the middle of the parking lot. A small woman in a tattered white dress, her long, dark hair hanging around her shoulders. She raised her head, and even from that distance, in the poor light, I could see that where her face should have been was a smooth, blank expanse of skin. Except for the eyes. She had eyes now. My eyes, looking out from that featureless face with an expression of patient hunger. I drove straight to Kona Airport on the other side of the island, running every red light, taking curves too fast, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that horror from the valleys. I abandoned the rental Jeep in the parking lot with the keys still in the ignition, rushed to the ticket counter and bought the first available flight to the mainland. A red-eye to Los Angeles, leaving in 2 hours. Those were the longest 2 hours of my life, spent pacing the terminal, jumping at every shadow, constantly looking over my shoulder. I bought clothes at an airport shop, overpriced tourist wear that didn't fit properly, but at least allowed me to look somewhat normal. I drank cup after cup of coffee, determined to stay awake until I was safely in the air. When they finally called my flight for boarding, I was the first in line. I took my seat by the window, fastened my seatbelt, and closed my eyes briefly in relief. When I opened them, she was standing in the aisle. The faceless woman, Kaiulani, Keone had called her, wearing her tattered white dress, water still somehow dripping from the hem to pool on the cabin floor. The other passengers didn't seem to notice her, moving past and through her as if she weren't there. But I saw her, and she saw me. She moved down the aisle toward me, gliding rather than walking now, her bare feet not quite touching the floor. The water that dripped from her dress left no trace on the carpet. I pressed myself against the window. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She stopped beside my row, her blank face turning toward me. Where her eyes should have been, I saw only smooth skin, yet I could feel her gaze boring into me. A flight attendant passed through her, checking overhead bins. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You look pale." I couldn't answer, could only stare at the horror standing in the aisle, invisible to everyone but me. The faceless woman reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching my cheek. I felt a cold so intense it burned, though her fingers hadn't made contact. "Sir?" The flight attendant sounded concerned now. "Do you need medical assistance?" The plane's engines roared to life. We began to taxi toward the runway. The faceless woman's hand withdrew. She stood motionless in the aisle, watching me with her non-eyes as the plane picked up speed. As we lifted off, as the wheels left Hawaiian soil, I thought I saw her form waver, like a reflection in troubled water. By the time we reached cruising altitude, she had vanished completely. I didn't sleep on that flight or on my connecting flight from LA to Denver. I didn't sleep in the airport hotel where I stayed that night, or on the final flight that brought me home to Michigan the following day. It's been 3 months now since I escaped Hawaii. I haven't slept more than an hour or two at a time since then. Every night I wake at exactly 3:17 a.m., heart pounding, certain that she's found me again. Sometimes, in the moment between sleeping and waking, I catch a glimpse of her standing in a corner of my bedroom or sitting at the foot of my bed. But when I turn on the light, she's gone. The dreams are the worst. In them, I'm back in Waimanu Valley, standing before that black pool. Each night, the faceless woman emerges from the water. Each night, her blank face develops more features. My features. And each night, my own face in the dream becomes smoother, blanker, until I'm the one without identity, without self. I've seen doctors, therapists, sleep specialists, they call it PTSD, prescribe medications that don't help, suggest exposure therapy and CBT, and a dozen other treatments that miss the point entirely. Because the truth is, she's still hunting me. Still hungry for what I have that she lost centuries ago. Distance has weakened her, as Keone promised it would, but she hasn't given up. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, when the isolation and exhaustion become too much to bear, I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just let her take what she wants. To surrender the hollow, empty thing my life has become since Kara left. To give my face, my identity, my pain to Kaiulani, and finally rest. I wonder this more and more lately. Last week, I found myself researching flights back to Hawaii, back to the Big Island, back to Waipio and Waimanu valleys, back to her. I haven't booked anything yet, but I will. Because now, when I look in the mirror, I sometimes catch a glimpse of something strange in my reflection. A momentary blankness, as if my features are trying to slide away. A foreign hunger in my eyes that isn't mine. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I find myself whispering a name. Not my name. Hers, Kaiulani. I think she's already begun to take what she wants, even from this distance. And I think soon I will go back to Hawaii to finish what started in those ancient valleys. To finally give my face to the one who has waited centuries to wear it. To finally sleep. My name is Marcus Reed, and I am 34 years old. This happened in August 2024. The Hawaiian sun was setting as I drove along the winding coastal road, casting long shadows across the lush landscape. My golden retriever, Scout, stuck his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind. 3 months since Michelle left, and I was still trying to find some semblance of peace. The divorce papers had been signed just last week. My therapist suggested a complete change of scenery, something to reset my mental state. Hawaii seemed as good a place as any to lose myself for a while. I'd chosen the Big Island for its diverse landscapes and relative solitude compared to the more tourist-heavy islands. My destination was the remote Waipio Valley on the northeastern Hamakua coast. The guidebook described it as the Valley of the Kings, a sacred place in Hawaiian culture with black sand beaches, towering waterfalls, and dense forests. Perfect for a week-long camping trip away from civilization, away from the reminders of my failed marriage. The rental Jeep handled the descent into the valley well enough, though the steep 25% grade made Scout whimper nervously. The valley floor opened up before us, a lush paradise framed by 2,000-foot cliffs on 3 sides and the vast Pacific on the 4th. "We made it, buddy," I said, reaching over to scratch behind Scout's ears. His tail wagged hesitantly. Something about his behavior seemed off. Scout was usually eager to explore new territory, but he remained pressed against the passenger door, watching the dense foliage with unusual intensity. I pulled over at a small clearing next to Wailoa Stream that fed into the ocean about a half-mile away. According to my research, this spot was technically outside the restricted areas of the valley where some private land and sacred sites were located. The last thing I wanted was trouble with locals or authorities. As I unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The dense jungle seemed to close in around the clearing, and the late afternoon shadows deepened with each passing minute. Scout stayed unusually close to my legs, occasionally emitting a low growl toward the tree line. "What's wrong, boy? You see something?" I scanned the perimeter but noticed nothing unusual beyond the chaotic tangle of tropical vegetation. Scout whined and pressed himself against my calf. We set up camp efficiently, a habit from my years of backcountry hiking before married life had curtailed my adventures. The 2-person tent seemed excessive now that it was just Scout and me, but I'd found it impossible to part with our camping gear when dividing possessions. Too many memories, perhaps, but also a stubborn hope that someday my life might return to normal. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of dehydrated camping food. Scout refused to eat, instead maintaining his vigilant watch of the surrounding forest. "You're being weird." "Scout," I muttered, though his behavior was beginning to affect me. The valley had grown eerily quiet. No birdsong, no insect chirps, just the distant rumble of Hilau Falls and the occasional crack of my campfire. I pulled out my phone. No signal, as expected. I'd downloaded offline maps of the area and had a satellite messenger for emergencies. The isolation had been the appeal after all. Time to think, to heal. Sleep came fitfully that night. Scout refused to settle, pacing the confines of the tent and growling at sounds I couldn't hear. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by his sudden, aggressive barking. "Scout! Quiet!" I hissed, fumbling for my headlamp. Outside, something moved through the underbrush. Something large. The beam of my light caught nothing but swaying vegetation. Scout's barking turned to whimpering, and he backed into the farthest corner of the tent, his eyes wide with fear. I'd never seen him like this. "It's probably just a wild pig," I whispered, trying to convince myself more than Scout. The Big Island was known for its feral pig population. Still, I kept my hunting knife close for the remainder of the night. Morning brought relief from the oppressive darkness, though low clouds hung over the valley, giving everything a gray, washed-out appearance. Scout seemed calmer but refused to stray more than a few feet from me. I decided to explore the nearby Hilau Falls. The guidebook listed it as one of the tallest waterfalls in Hawaii, with a drop of over 1,400 feet. The trail was overgrown but followable, winding through dense forest alongside the stream that fed into the waterfall. An hour into our hike, Scout froze mid-stride. The hair along his spine stood on end, and a deep, rumbling growl emanated from his chest. Ahead on the trail stood an elderly Hawaiian man. His weathered face was impassive, watching us with dark, unblinking eyes. "Aloha," I called, raising a hand in greeting. "Sorry if we're intruding." The man didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly strong. "Haole shouldn't be here. Not now." I'm sorry, I replied, confused by his hostility. I checked the maps. This isn't private property or restricted land. Not all Kapu is on paper, he said cryptically. The valley speaks. Sometimes it takes. You hear the call? The call? I asked. The valley calls to the broken, draws them in. His eyes shifted to look directly at Scout, who was now whimpering. Your animal knows. They always know. A chill ran down my spine despite the humid air. Look, I don't want any trouble. We're just camping for a few days. Kapo mahina make, he said, then switched back to English. Dead moon night? Tomorrow. Stay in your tent. Don't answer if something calls your name. With that, he turned and walked into the forest, disappearing with unnatural quickness. Hey, wait, I called after him, but he was gone. Scout refused to continue toward the falls, pulling insistently back toward camp. Unsettled by both the man's warning and my dog's behavior, I reluctantly turned back. At camp, I checked my satellite messenger, suddenly eager for some connection to the outside world. The device was dead, battery completely drained despite having been fully charged before the trip. My phone showed the same, its battery mysteriously depleted. That's not possible, I muttered, pulling out my portable charger. It, too, was dead. As afternoon faded into evening, the valley seemed to close in around us. The clouds had lowered, creating a ceiling of mist that trapped the waning light. I built the fire larger than necessary, seeking comfort in its warm glow. Scout refused to leave the fireside, his eyes constantly scanning the darkening forest. I tried to dismiss the old man's warning as local superstition or perhaps an attempt to scare off tourists. But as night fell completely, I couldn't shake the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the valley. Sleep was impossible. Scout maintained his vigil, occasionally growling at shadows beyond the firelight. I checked my watch, 11:42 p.m. The fire was burning low, and I debated whether to add more wood. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond camp. Scout went rigid, his growl silenced by what seemed like fear. I reached for my flashlight, sweeping its beam toward the sound. For a brief moment, I caught sight of a figure at the edge of the light. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It melted back into the darkness before I could make out details. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. No response came. The rest of the night passed in a state of hypervigilance. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but determined to leave. Valley of the Kings or not, something felt deeply wrong about this place. I packed quickly, throwing gear haphazardly into the Jeep. Scout seemed just as eager to leave, hovering near the vehicle's open door. As I shouldered my backpack, a voice called from the tree line. "Leaving so soon, Howley?" I turned to find a different Hawaiian man approaching. Younger, maybe in his 40s, with an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, change of plans," I replied, continuing to load the Jeep. "Chemo giving you trouble?" he asked, stepping closer. "Old man likes to scare the tourists with his ghost stories." I paused. "Chemo, the old man I met yesterday." The newcomer nodded. "He believes the old ways, thinks the valley is sacred, that spirits walk here during Kapo Mahina Make, the dead moon." "And you don't believe that?" I asked, noting how Scout had positioned himself between me and the man. "I believe the valley has history." He extended his hand. "I'm Keone. My family has lived here for generations." I reluctantly shook his hand. "Marcus, and this is Scout. The path you were on yesterday leads to some dangerous areas. Flash floods this time of year. I could show you a safer route if you're interested in seeing the falls." Something in his manner put me on edge. His grip had been too tight, his palm unnaturally cold despite the humid morning air. "Thanks, but we're heading out. Family emergency," I lied. Keone's smile faltered momentarily. "That's a shame. The valley shows its true beauty to very few." He reached down as if to pet Scout, who backed away with a snarl. "Protective dog you have." Yeah, he doesn't warm up to strangers quickly, I said, opening the driver's door. Thanks anyway. Keown stepped back, his eyes now cold. The road out is tricky after yesterday's rain. Be careful on the switchbacks. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the same section of forest where the old man had vanished. I climbed into the Jeep, Scout jumping in beside me. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. Come on, I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I popped the hood to check the engine, though I knew little about car mechanics. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, but when I tried to reconnect my phone to call for help, I found it completely dead again, despite having charged it minimally from a power bank. Looks like we're staying another day, Scout, I said grimly. My dog whined in response, pressing himself against the seat. With no choice but to wait for another hiker or tourist to come along, I reluctantly re-established our camp. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from the dense foliage surrounding the clearing. The day dragged on with unusual slowness. The cloud cover never lifted, casting the valley in perpetual twilight. I attempted to distract myself by reading one of the paperbacks I'd brought, but found it impossible to focus. Scout remained alert, his eyes tracking movement in the forest that I couldn't perceive. By mid-afternoon, I'd made a decision. We're hiking out, I told Scout, who perked up at my determined tone. The road out of the valley was steep, a challenging hike under normal circumstances, but staying felt increasingly dangerous. I packed a day bag with water, some food, and essential survival gear. The rest would have to be abandoned for now. As I shouldered the pack, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. Great, I muttered, looking up at the darkening sky. Rain would make the already treacherous road nearly impassable on foot. We set out anyway, Scout leading the way with newfound energy. The trail ascending from the valley floor was as steep as I remembered, the switchbacks barely visible through the overgrown vegetation. We'd made it perhaps a quarter of the way up when the rain began, a sudden torrential downpour rather than the gradual buildup I'd expected. Within minutes, the trail became a muddy river, making each step treacherous. Keep going, I encouraged Scout, who was struggling to find footing on the increasingly slick surface. A flash of lightning illuminated the valley below, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. In that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that turned my blood cold. Multiple figures standing in our abandoned campsite, their faces turned upward, watching our ascent. The rain intensified, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. A section of the trail gave way under my foot, sending me sliding several yards down the muddy incline before I could catch myself on a protruding root. Scout barked frantically from above, unable to reach me. "Stay!" I commanded, not wanting him to risk the unstable section. As I struggled to pull myself up, another flash of lightning revealed a figure standing directly above me on the trail. For a moment, I felt relief, a fellow hiker who could help. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized with horror that the proportions were all wrong. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Its face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice nearly lost in the storm. The figure took a step toward me, moving with an unnatural fluidity. Scout's barking turned to high-pitched whines of terror. I scrambled up the slope, desperation giving me strength. As I reached the trail again, the figure was gone, though Scout continued to stare at the spot where it had stood, his body trembling. "Come on, boy," I urged, no longer certain if climbing out was safer than returning to camp. The decision was made for us when a section of the trail ahead collapsed entirely, taking down a sizable portion of the mountainside with it. Our path out was completely blocked. With no alternative, we began the descent back to the valley floor. The rain continued unabated, soaking us to the skin and reducing visibility to mere feet. It was during one particularly intense cloudburst that Scout suddenly darted off the trail, barking furiously. "Scout, come back!" I yelled, chasing after him into the dense undergrowth. I caught glimpses of his golden coat as he navigated through the vegetation with single-minded determination. When I finally caught up to him, he was standing at the entrance to what appeared to be a cave set into the valley wall, a detail I'd somehow missed in my previous exploration. Scout refused to enter, instead backing away with his tail between his legs. The cave opening was roughly circular, about 6 feet in diameter, with strange markings carved into the surrounding stone. They seemed ancient, weathered by centuries of exposure. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the cave offered the only immediate shelter. "We don't have a choice, buddy," I told Scout, tugging gently on his collar. He resisted with surprising strength, his eyes never leaving the dark opening. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, made the decision for us. I pulled out my flashlight and, with Scout reluctantly in tow, entered the cave. The interior was larger than the entrance suggested, opening into a chamber about 30 feet deep. The walls were smooth, almost polished in places, with more of the strange symbols etched into the stone. The air inside was surprisingly dry and carried a faint metallic odor. "It's just until the storm passes," I assured Scout, who stood rigid at the entrance, refusing to come deeper into the cave. I removed my soaked pack and searched for dry clothes, grateful that I'd waterproofed the contents. As I changed, I examined the cave more carefully. The markings seemed to tell a story, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. In the center of the chamber, the floor dipped slightly to form a shallow basin. At the far end, a narrow tunnel extended deeper into the mountain. Curiosity piqued, I directed my flashlight down the passage. The beam revealed more carved symbols and what appeared to be a small altar or table of stone. "Hello," a voice called from outside the cave. "Anyone in there?" Scout's growl was immediate and threatening. I put a restraining hand on his collar. "Yeah, we're sheltering from the storm," I called back, moving toward the entrance. The rain had eased slightly, allowing me to make out a figure standing just outside. "Keon. Thought that was your dog I heard," he said, stepping closer to the entrance. "You shouldn't be in there." "It was this or get washed down the mountainside," I replied, noting how Scout's growl deepened as Keon approached. "This place is kapu, forbidden," Keon said, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. "Even I don't enter." "We'll leave as soon as the rain stops," I promised, increasingly uneasy. Keon stood silent for a moment, rain dripping from his clothing. Something about his stillness was unnerving. "What is this place?" I asked, hoping to break the tension. "A bad place," he replied simply. "From old times. Before my people. Before many things." He looked past me into the cave. "They said the valley calls to the broken. Are you broken, Marcus?" The question sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. I thought of Michelle, of the divorce, of the emptiness that had driven me to this remote valley. "We're leaving now," I said firmly, gathering my still wet pack. "Storm or no storm." Keon's expression shifted to something like disappointment. "Too late for that, I think." He nodded toward the back of the cave. "It's already waking." I turned to look where he indicated. In the dim light, I could see that the narrow passage at the rear of the cave now emitted a faint, pulsing glow. When I turned back, Keon was gone. "Keon," I called out, stepping to the cave entrance. There was no sign of him in any direction, just the steady rain falling on the dense forest. Scout's barking drew my attention back to the cave interior. The glow from the passage had intensified, casting long, dancing shadows across the symbols on the walls. The markings seemed to shift and move in the unstable light. A low, humming sound began to emanate from deep within the mountain, growing steadily in volume until it was a physical presence, vibrating in my chest cavity. "We're getting out of here," I told Scout, who needed no encouragement. We burst from the cave into the rain, no longer caring about the storm or the treacherous conditions. Night was falling rapidly, far too quickly to be natural. The valley was plunged into a darkness deeper than seemed possible, with only occasional flashes of lightning providing brief moments of visibility. We stumbled through the forest, no longer following any trail, just moving away from the cave as quickly as possible. Scout led the way, his senses far more reliable than mine in the darkness. A particularly vivid lightning flash illuminated a figure standing directly in our path, the old man, Chemo. "I warned you," he said, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "Kapo Mahina Make brings them from below." "What's happening?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. "What is that cave?" "A door," he replied simply, "and you've opened it." Before I could question him further, Scout's frantic barking turned my attention to the forest behind us. Multiple shapes moved through the trees. Tall, elongated figures gliding between the trunks with fluid grace. "They're coming," Chemo said matter-of-factly. "They hunger for the broken ones." "How do we stop them?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Chemo's weathered face showed a hint of compassion. "You can't stop them, but you might outrun them." He pointed toward a barely visible path. "That way leads to the falls. Cross behind them to reach the old heiau, the temple. Sacred ground. They cannot follow there." Another lightning flash revealed the figures drawing closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. I caught glimpses of impossibly long limbs and features that weren't quite human. "What are they?" I whispered. "The Forgotten Ones," Chemo replied cryptically. "Now go. I will delay them." "Come with us," I urged, but Chemo shook his head. "My path is different. Go." He pushed me toward the trail, then turned to face the approaching figures. Scout and I ran blindly through the rain-soaked forest, following the faint path. Behind us, a sudden scream cut through the storm, high-pitched and agonized. I didn't look back. The roar of Hilawi Falls grew louder as we approached. In the near-total darkness, I could barely make out the massive curtain of water plunging from the cliff above. The path led dangerously close to the edge of the pool at the base of the falls. Behind the waterfall, I remembered Chemo saying, but the rocks were slick with spray, the current swift and powerful. A strange keening sound rose from the forest behind us. Not quite human, not quite animal. Scout pressed against my legs, trembling violently. "We have to try," I told him, searching the cliff face. There, barely visible in the darkness, a narrow ledge ran behind the waterfall, connecting to what might be a cave or tunnel. Another unearthly cry, closer now. I grabbed Scout's collar and led him into the frigid water at the edge of the pool. The current immediately tried to pull us in, but I managed to find footing on the submerged rocks. We inched our way along the cliff face, the thunder of the falling water nearly deafening. The ledge was slick and treacherous, barely wide enough for us to pass single file. Scout whimpered but followed closely. "Marcus!" My name floated above the roar of the falls, spoken in a voice that was almost, but not quite, Michelle's. "Marcus, help me." I faltered, nearly losing my footing on the slippery ledge. The voice was coming from the darkness behind the falls. "Don't answer," I whispered to myself, remembering Chemo's warning. "Don't answer if something calls your name." We pressed on, the ledge widening slightly as it curved behind the massive waterfall. The spray was blinding, soaking us completely as we navigated by touch alone. "Marcus, please, I'm scared." The voice was perfect now, exactly Michelle's, with the slight catch she got when she was trying not to cry. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to call out to her. Scout's warning growl kept me silent. Finally, we reached the other side of the falls. The ledge opened onto a small plateau carved into the cliff face. Ancient stone structures, barely more than piles of rocks now, formed what must have been the heiau Chemo mentioned. The plateau was eerily dry and calm, as if the storm couldn't touch this place. The rain continued to fall in sheets just feet away, but not a drop reached us here. "We made it, Scout," I said, dropping to my knees in exhaustion. My dog remained alert, watching the way we had come. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. We would wait for daylight before attempting to leave the valley. Surely, whatever was happening would end with the night. As I sat among the ancient stones, a strange calm settled over me. The fear remained, but it was distant now, observational rather than all-consuming. In this sacred place I felt protected, if not safe. Hours passed. The rain eventually stopped, and the clouds parted to reveal a sliver of moon high overhead. True to Chemo's words, it was a dead moon, waning to almost nothing, giving little light. I must have dozed off because I awoke with a start to Scout's low warning growl. Dawn was approaching, the eastern sky lightening behind the valley walls. A figure stood at the edge of the plateau where the ledge met our sanctuary. In the growing light, I could see it clearly for the first time. Unnaturally tall and thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its skin was the pale gray of cave fish, stretched too tight over an elongated frame. Where its face should have been was a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, with just a slight indentation where a mouth might form. It made no move to enter the heiau, instead standing perfectly still, watching us with senses I couldn't comprehend. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle. When it spoke, its voice emerged from the indentation that stretched and tore into a crude approximation of a mouth. "To fill the emptiness," it said in a voice that was both ancient and childlike. "What emptiness?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Yours," it replied simply. "The valley calls to the broken, offers to fill what was taken." "I'm not broken," I lied, thinking of Michelle, of the life I'd lost. The creature's non-face seemed to register something like amusement. "All who come here are broken. All seek to be made whole." It gestured with an impossibly long arm toward the forest below. "Some join us willingly." In the growing light, I could make out figures moving among the trees, human in general shape, but wrong in their movements. With a jolt of horror, I recognized Keon among them, his once human form now elongated and distorted. "The Old One gave you temporary sanctuary," the creature continued. "But you must leave this place when the sun rises, and we will be waiting." As if on cue, the first rays of sunlight crested the valley rim, casting long shadows across the plateau. The creature retreated a step. "Choose, Broken One. Join us willingly or run. The result will be the same." With that, it slipped away, moving with liquid grace back along the ledge and disappearing behind the falls. I turned to Scout, who looked up at me with unwavering trust. "We're getting out of here, buddy," I promised him. "Together." As the day brightened, I studied our surroundings more carefully. The plateau connected to a narrow trail leading up the cliff face, an ancient path that might bypass the washed-out road entirely. We set out immediately, climbing the steep trail with desperate energy. The path was treacherous in places, crumbling under our weight, but we pressed on. By midday, we had reached the valley rim, emerging onto the main road a mile from where I'd parked the Jeep days earlier. Exhausted but driven by fear, we continued along the road, hoping to encounter other tourists or locals. It was nearly 2 hours later when a pickup truck approached, driven by a young Hawaiian woman who eyed us with concern. "You okay, brah?" she asked, rolling down her window. "You look like you've been through it." "Our car broke down in the valley," I explained, not mentioning anything else. "Could you give us a ride to the nearest town?" She hesitated, looking us over. "You was camping in Waipio? During Kapo Mahina Make?" I froze at her words. "You know about that?" Her expression grew serious. "Everybody local knows not to go there certain nights. Bad things happen." She reached across to open the passenger door. "Get in. Let's get you somewhere safe." As we drove away, I couldn't resist looking back. The valley stretched behind us, beautiful and serene in the midday sun, but I knew what waited in its shadows, what would emerge again when darkness fell. "Don't look back," the woman advised, noticing my gaze. "Some say they can follow the attention like a trail." I faced forward, focusing on the road ahead, on the distance growing between us and the valley. Scout sat between us on the bench seat, his head finally lowered in exhaustion. "My uncle went missing there," she said after several minutes of silence. 3 years ago. Some say they hear his voice sometimes, calling from the forest. I thought of the voice that had sounded like Michelle's, calling my name from behind the falls. "I'm sorry," I said simply. She nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "The valley calls to the broken ones," she said, echoing what I'd been told. "Those with holes inside them." I didn't respond, but my hand moved unconsciously to my bare ring finger, to the tan line that was only now beginning to fade. We reached Honokaa an hour later. The woman, who introduced herself as Leilani, dropped us at a small motel on the outskirts of town. "Don't go back there," she said as I climbed out. It wasn't a request. "I won't," I promised. That night, in the safety of the motel room, I finally checked my phone, which had mysteriously regained its charge once we left the valley. There were 3 missed calls from Michelle. The latest message was brief. "Marcus, I've been thinking a lot about us. Maybe we were too hasty. Call me when you get this." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the emptiness inside me, the broken places that had drawn me to the valley, that had nearly cost me everything. Scout watched me from his place on the motel bed, his eyes knowing. I deleted the message. Some emptiness shouldn't be filled. 3 days later, we boarded a flight back to the mainland. As the plane lifted off, I caught a final glimpse of the island's lush landscape, of the distant valley hidden among the mountains. For a brief moment, I thought I saw elongated figures standing at the valley rim, their featureless faces turned upward, watching our departure. But then we passed through a cloud bank, and the island vanished from view. Michelle called twice more after we returned home. I never answered. Some brokenness is safer than being made whole by the wrong things. But sometimes in dreams, I hear the valley calling my name.